So we're entering our question and answer. Thank you very much for your presentation. If we can have the panelists come and sit down. If the live audience has a question, when it's time, please raise your hand. For those of you streaming for this event, please add your question to the Q&A. Yeah. I'm sorry I didn't put seat assignments. First of all, thank you everybody for being here. You know, we had that panel, we had our session yesterday, and it was a lot easier for me to come up with questions than it is for this one. Because everybody was just, there's certainly an interrelatedness, but also each presentation was very tight, I guess you could say, so it's sort of hard to figure out, you know, where to come in. So there was a couple of themes that I thought was important. And it was the idea, I think, from everybody about rebuilding, but how using native art to rebuild. So Ashley, you had mentioned that through your exploration of native art helped you move forward with your own identity. And I noticed a lot of the images that you referenced was Cherokee. Nancy and Celestina, you had mentioned how there's this connection between these photographs. And what was the time period for the photographs?
1974 to, what was the ending date?
2000s, like 2003, 2005. That's just the paper photos that are in the archive.
Okay. Yeah. So in a way, at least the way that I was looking at it, was that there's this portion of history which is captured in photographs and sort of lost in a way, and then you two working with the community is rebuilding that connection, not only for an urban environment, but also for individual families. And Dallin, you had mentioned that how some of your work is rebuilding, at least is the way that I interpret it, some of your work, not only your, I don't want to say professional work because that implies that you're an amateur artist, but your two professions and how they sort of interrelate in a way is rebuilding or continuing to build a native art aspect. So with that, see, I had a question here. I'm trying to figure out where I was going. I got so much into the setup, I forgot what the question was. So I think one of the challenges for me, and I want to be jumping all over the place because this is honestly a challenging one to narrate because it was really good. Not implying the other ones weren't so good, but you know what I mean. So one of the challenges that I find with native art today, as we have defining it here, is all three presentations were very specific. In a sense, Cherokee, Arapaho, and UAII. And they all fit in these packages. And then when I think about native art today, and I have friends and other folks who I know who create native art, and oftentimes their work is very much focusing on their own tribal traditions, and their photography is focusing on their own tribal traditions. And I think, Ashley, you mentioned the term art as a cultural connector. But one thing I notice today is, particularly when I was involved with it in the 90s, is I noticed a lot of native artists were doing work from their own tribe. We talked about sort of connecting and this rebuilding. But I'll say probably in the last 5 or 10 years, I've noticed a lot of artists are exploring traditions from other tribes and putting it within their own work. So as we think about rebuilding our own community, as for me, it's a Anin, a Grovan, and Cherokee, and et cetera, et cetera. And we see this artwork that is, in a way, pan-native by including your own work. And other works from other tribes, and sometimes they don't have any connection. As viewers and those that appreciate it, and some of us have a little more in-depth knowledge, and some of us don't, and I'm more of the don't. How do we process that? How do we process what the creation of material that's today that is not necessarily reflection of their own traditions? And Dallin, you made the point of how Native art doesn't really, and I completely am on board, isn't really traditional, which has ties to historic and contemporary, but there should be no wall there. It should all come together because like everything else, it's constantly moving, right? So how do we wrestle with this sort of pan-Indian creation of Native works, whether it is whatever media we want to go about?
I'd be happy to jump in. So I'm going to respond as an educator, and I guess I would start with thinking about, actually, Dylan's your slide. So that's our group. Those are Chiricahua Apache babies. I've got all their names if you ever want to have the ID for that slide, right? So, it's the boarding school legacy. So Native folks here and at home, like I've got cousins that can claim 5 tribes, So part of it is the reality of what we're living, right? And some of it is boarding school, some of it's urban relocation, right? So we're leading these very complex lives just in terms of our genealogies. I think that's part of it. But I have noticed the same thing that you're talking about, and I like the idea of us being able to be specific and then branch out to global, because the other part is global indigeneity, right? We're moving within those spaces. I've been curating at the Venice Biennale for forever, and a lot of Native folks are moving in there and having a common conversation across the ocean. I find that stuff really exciting, but I hear, and tell me if I'm correct, a little bit of frustration, because as educators, it's like, well, how do we explain this level of complexity, especially for folks who come into an exhibit and are surprised that Native people are still alive? Like we're working with a very low bar often with the public. And how do we increase that? And I'll just harp back onto what a lot of Knowing Native Arts was about, is that this is an academic field and that we are totally under-resourced. We're totally underfunded in terms of programs for natives and non-natives to understand what is historic art, what are these regions, who are the great names, where are we going in the future, where we've been in the past, what's happening in museums. I think we need more educational support, and I'm talking about the big money. You guys, bring it on. We want some Mellon, we want Ford, we want whoever can Terra. You guys bring it on, because that infrastructure is yet to be built. I mean, I go to exhibits and I see often, or panel sessions, they're using the same title of a show from 30 years ago, but not remembering it was 30 years ago. Or we get Art Journal and they've got essays and all of the authors, they're not even citing any other author, from the past, as if we're inventing it anew every generation. So I'll let other panelists speak, but for me, that's my main frustration, is I just think we need more infrastructure for the discipline, for the field of Native arts.
I got some strong feelings about this, unless somebody wants to jump in.
Hold on, let me get comfortable.
No, I'll keep it brief. I'll keep it
No,
brief.
please. We're very good on time, so you do you.
After this presentation, it actually might be surprising to hear that I don't think it's appropriate at all. That I think there are tribal concepts and design elements that should remain within that tribe. Can they be interpreted in a contemporary way? Absolutely. Are there myriads of different exceptions? Absolutely. You've got cross-cultural intertribal marriages happening. You've got myself, I'm the product of 2 totally different tribes. One a classic Eastern woodland, another one very much a plains cultural tribe. And I incorporate both oftentimes into my work. But again, there are things that, there's a reason we do our Sundance in Arapaho. There are concepts that can't be translated into English. We have to, though, because many of us aren't fluent as we need to be. You can take that onion a little further in the layers, right? And look at people who have appropriated an entire identity that they don't belong to and became academics or became artists who are presenting a culture that they didn't grow up in, that they know nothing about? How do you explain imagery? You can replicate it. So are you a historian or are you just a reenactor? I mentioned our culture being living, breathing, evolving. But some of those things, it's the difference between the sacred and the secular again. Those things that when I first started powwow dancing, my northern Arapaho uncle, he's like, oh, that's good. Learning beadwork, you're putting designs, Arapaho designs in your work. Just remember, this isn't your ceremonies. Don't let it become your religion. And I didn't even know what that meant at the time. I was like 12, right? But as I got older, I got to reflect on those things, and I could see military societies in some of these dances. I could see a tradition of power that these things came from. But at the same time, that powwow was an intertribal social dance. It was an opportunity to make friends, meet your future ex-wives. It was all those things, right? All those good things that come from powwows. But again, it wasn't our Sundance. It wasn't our pipe ceremonies. And so when we ask that question, is it complicated? Absolutely. Should you try it? Don't do it, man. You're gonna mess it up. No, I'm just kidding. But those are great conversations to have because it's not an easy answer, and we're not gonna define it today. But we can talk about it and see how we feel, and maybe someday down the road we'll come to some kind of consensus. But again, there are some things that should stay within the tribe. How do I talk about Kiowa culture when I've never been to society dances, when I've met lots of Kiowas? I don't even have any Kiowa exes. That's amazing. But I would feel a little awkward if a Kiowa person said, hey, why did you use that symbol? Because I can tell you exactly why I used every single thing that I do in my artwork. I know what they mean. The beauty of illustrative Plains narrative art is that it was the detail. The devil's in the details. You could tell who they were, well, partly because they had a name glyph right above their head, right? But their hairstyle, their outfits, the leggings, the moccasin designs, it was all who they were. I saw that look at the watch, so I was like, I'm done, Joe, I'm done.
I was not checking my heart rate this time. In the spirit of full disclosure, Ben, which is somewhere, he sends me a message. There you are. He says, feel free to run long. We're doing really well. So he's sending me messages about time so I want everybody to think I'm going, oh my God, it's going on too long. So
it's the digital big hook. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Here at the Autry, we're very much into communications, which means
You guys are.
our days are full of meetings.
That was really all I had to say about it, though.
Okay.
I mean, there's a reason I only talked about Cherokee artists in my dissertation was because I didn't want to step out of a place where I felt comfortable analyzing these artists, making these sort of broad statements about really complicated things such as identity and worldview in a way that only I could understand. I couldn't talk about another community in that same way. It would have been not only disingenuous, but it would have been inappropriate for me. And I think that there is something to be said for innovation as opposed to appropriation. That, Native people, we have been innovators with our art always. When we meet a new community and they have something we think is really cool, we figure out a way to incorporate it. But there's also boundaries of cultural things that are not allowed to cross those boundaries. And that's where that uncomfortableness comes between seeing somebody who has found a really exciting new material that they have learned about through their travels. We're global people now. We exist in a global world through social media, through our travels. But there's a difference between bringing in that sort of innovative aspect to material and to how you're presenting your work and taking something that is not yours, which is where that uncomfortableness comes and where we go, oh, I don't think you should have made that. That was not yours to make.
Celestina, I have a specific question for you. I love the presentation. And as I was looking at those older photographs, particularly the ones in the 70s, it reminded me of a couple things. It reminded me of the photographs from Alcatraz, and also a project I worked on with my father a number of years ago, where we had historic photographs, and we visited our community with these photographs, some of the elders, trying to identify who is who. With some success, some limited success, let's just put it that way. So I'm wondering, there's a certain connection, particularly, and everybody here talked about the history, when you see a photograph of your ancestor that you've never seen before. And I know you've been working on this project for a long time, and you had mentioned that you had shown the photograph to some of these families. And I'm wondering if you can just reflect on that experience of your interaction with the family and how that experience went for you.
It's on? Yeah, okay. It's always, I feel like it's very special. I really try to give as much space and be as respectful as I know how to be, but always make sure that I'm asking if we are, like, as we're talking, like, whenever you want to stop, if you want to stop, or if I'm asking something that you don't want to share with me that's inappropriate or those things, then just let me know. Because especially working with photos that are of peoples from, currently UAII serves over 200 different tribes, right? So people from all over the country, all over the, Americas. And I don't think I'll ever know exactly how to share a photo that may be of somebody who's passed, or maybe I'm not supposed to do that. There's a number of different, like, there's so many different protocols that I just need to and that I need to, like, follow whatever the person is telling me about the photo, about how to continue looking at the photo, thinking about the photo. So it's been and also being, again, careful that if we're going to go in, if we're starting to talk about something that is painful, that you don't have to share that with me, or with anybody, or if you want to, I'm willing to listen. So it's exciting, and also, very, I feel very cautious as I go in and talk with people, like, because there has been times where I hear a story and, we have to sit with it for a while. So I hope that answers the question, but I think it has also been really amazing to, over time, where there's been a number of different people who could never identify that person, and then one day you meet somebody and they're like, that's so-and-so. And it's like, wonderful, what else can you say about them? Are they still around? Where's their family? So, and I think it just really gives a foundation for so many generations that have been in Los Angeles now, and also always recognizing that we're in, Tongva territory, that this is ancestral land of the Tongva peoples, and that there's also these generations of people who have called the city home. And it doesn't mean that we're, or that everyone doesn't go back and forth to tribal lands or home, but that there's a lot of time kind of spent here in our everyday, and that there's a lot of power and home and community in that as well.
Yeah, a little plug for Celestina, because she's a third generation Los Angelino and her children are fourth generation here. And so I think that's kind of standard, right, for a lot of the community.
I think it varies, but yes, I think there's myself, and then there's so many other families who've been here for so long that, again, I want to make sure that our children, my children, feel like they have a community here that has many generations, that has a history that they can also be connected to, in addition to their tribal homes.
Thank you. Ashley, I have a very specific question.
Who's it from?
that probably is not as complicated as it should be, but I think it's just me. It says much scholarship, by the way, this comes via the internet. Much scholarship has compared the current Palestine situation to that of indigenous peoples. It's difficult to conceive Palestinians considering their cultural output as a subfield of Israeli art. Another example could be the efforts made by Maori to distinguish their cultural history and contemporary art from non-Maori cultural production. How do you reconcile your approach to include Native art as a subfield of American settler? That's his thing here, by the way. Settler art, or similar efforts by institutions such as the Met to interweave Native art as American art. With these other efforts to maintain the integrity of indigenous cultural production.
That is a big question.
It is.
So I would start by saying there is no America. There is, Israel and Palestine, and there is New Zealand, but there's the United States, there's the continent here. And so that's where I'm saying American art doesn't exist because there is no America. And it's this umbrella term that has gotten appropriated to describe something. I really have just started exploring this theme, so I don't have those answers yet. I'm still figuring out how I'm approaching this concept, and it's come out of trying to figure out where Native art can fit in American art, whatever that might be. And so I think that is an obvious next step of thinking about this global then repercussions of that. But I'm not an expert in any of those countries and their art production, so I don't have the answer to it.
Okay. Nancy, would you like to comment?
What she said.
Okay. All right, very good. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
So much.
No. I mean, it's a great question. I don't mean to diminish the question, but yeah, again, we're talking about categories, and categories are made to be broken. Like I love the Venn diagram metaphor that you used. Like let's get off of a linear track and even a regional track. I mean, I think part of what's happened with art history, and I was trained as a cultural anthropologist, y'all, so I can take a dig at art history here. I mean, you can imagine those color-coded maps. Well, okay, Anthro does that too, right? There's yellow here and blue, and you can envision what the United States looks like with these color-coded maps. I mean, who came up with that? I mean, I think we need to be really open and attentive to the specifics to start out with how you introduced this Q&A session, and to highlight those. And if we're making a generalization, to make that generalization on something that makes sense. So, for example, the California Basket Weavers Association here, it makes a lot of sense, they're women that need access to those natural materials. They've got common problems with the environment, with pesticides, with fires. So yes, let's make a Basket Weavers Association here in California. That makes sense. I'm a product of the Institute of American Indian Arts. I love that school. I do a lot for that school. I feel like it's a home. It makes sense for me to continue in that vein because it is a tribal college, and it's doing the good work. And so I can reference freely there. I feel comfortable in a pan-Native kind of approach because I taught there, I went to school there, I published with them. That makes sense. So I think it's, rather than being kind of deductive about this, I think being more intuitive, right? Starting from reality and building theory out from that rather than the opposite.
Dallin or Celestina, any comments?
Sort of, right? I think it's very human of all of us to want to categorize things so that we can conceptualize them a little easier. We can classify them in a way that puts other parts of our own lives in context. I would start by saying, do we really need to do that with cultures that we don't come from? I don't profess to know the politics and the history of that Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Nor with the Maoris. They have a very complicated history as well. much like many of our cultures. But what I do know is that I can appreciate their art, I can appreciate their cultures for what they are, and accept them without my prejudice or bias or perspectives, and just try and find that beauty. Maybe it's simple, I don't know, but I don't think it's inappropriate.
So we have two questions that interrelate to each other, which interrelate to what we're talking about, which all has to do with, well, essentially, has to do with where do we put Native American art in the museum? One says, well, Native American art, if we think about, as Dallin had mentioned in his presentation, contemporary art directly related to traditional art, which is directly related because it predates American settler art, and I'm using her term, shouldn't it have its own area? Others say, well, do our museums putting Native art on their own, or are they putting Native art within the American art gallery? So it's a bit of and as a second generation museum person, of course, I have my own opinions, but this is not my show, it's yours. Thoughts?
Why do we keep having to divide things by culture or by time period or by, chronology? Why can't we start thinking about museums as spaces for thinking about themes, about larger ideas? And that's really what I'm thinking, is that let's just throw it all out. Like, let's literally empty out all the museums and rethink them. As I don't currently work in a museum, so it's easy for me to say.
Easier said than done.
But why don't we do that? Like, why don't we think how museums are done and rethink it in a way that is much more, I think, humanistic, and that there are so many cross-cultural moments that can happen through art when you break it down to themes and concepts and ideas and passions, rather than, okay, this is the Native art over here, and this is the early American art over here. We have the contemporary art over there, and we might mix a couple of things in between each other, but we're gonna pretty much keep those things where they are because that makes the most sense. And does it? Wouldn't it be more exciting to go and see a dynamic space that's telling new stories all the time?
Yeah, I would like a higher level of dialogue also. I think it's possible. I think it's doable in the museum world to do that. I think museums in general, I have to give a shout out to Rick in the audience. Thank you, Rick, for helping us get that NEA grant. He wrote our letter of recommendation. I always give him full credit. So I worked with a cognitive scientist, Alexandra Sherman, who is now, she was a junior prof, and now she's chair of cognitive sciences at Occidental College. And we did a museum experiment right here at the Autry, and it was called Seeing American Indians. We put Curtis photographs up. We ended up getting physiological data from museum visitors, things like, skin conductivity and heart rate. And then we did a lab setting with eye tracking to see where prompts would bring people. And at the end of the day, our findings, we actually didn't want to tell the Autry what to do, but the education department was like, okay, we've done a lot for you. Can you just tell us what to do now? So we had to make recommendations. And our recommendation was, can we just have museum visitors pause? Because I think there's a gallop towards having an answer, towards checking a box. I saw this. I conquered that. I get this, And there's also a tendency to do what it's sort of like the entrance narrative. It's a theme if you do museum studies literature, right? That people want to be affirmed from what they already know in a museum, and they actually don't want to learn anything new. They just want to be affirmed that their opinions were always correct, and they just want to see that. And so I think it's a move towards getting visitors and visitors who might be out there to go into a museum with a not knowing perspective, right? To pause and say, I really don't know what's going on here at all. I don't know where this fits. I need to think about this more, and to have that exploratory moment. But I think museums now, I mean, it's fast paced, and, the museum visitor spends, 3 seconds in front of a piece of artwork, right? So I think our challenge is just how to slow down the educational process in the museum setting, which we know is emotionally laden for people. So if you're in a lab and you're looking at a screen, you're not going to get half of what you get when you're seeing the real thing. We know that. So your emotions are heightened. You're in a space. You carved out the time. We just have to slow the process down a little bit and make people feel more comfortable with not having a category to check. And that's going to be a challenge.
Well, my immediate thought after you asked the question was everywhere. And it doesn't have to be in a specific section. But I also started to think about just the museum space as just a broader educational space and a community space, really. I think the Autry has done a pretty good job about opening these spaces up to the community. Like, I've been on the stage with a bunch of kids before, like there's a dance workshop here on Thursday nights that UAII does. And, so to me, this is like, it's more than the gallery spaces, and the art is a piece of it, but it's not the only kind of reason why you come to the museum, right? It should be to learn, to see other people, to come to community meetings, so I just want it to be much more of an active space, which I think the Autry is doing a good job at.
Yeah, just real quickly, to echo what my colleagues have said, the first step is probably asking, is there even really a right answer, Yes, there are themes, prehistoric art, native art prior to contact, 1700s, whatever it is, that's fine to classify, right? But even with all the right steps, a native consultant, a native curator, a tribal land acknowledgement happening, armpits and elbows. It's like the opinions are like armpits and elbows. Everybody's got one or two, hopefully. But they can look wildly different. They can present wildly differently, right? And so again, there just may not be the right answer, but there can be good positive things happening as we look at how we explore these experiences, for sure.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to offer my 2 cents on this. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. The Native American experience is an exclusively unique experience in the history of this country. There's nobody else here who has had this experience and had this story. And I come from the perspective that the vast majority of non-native people, I think over the past several years it's gotten better, but they don't necessarily understand or have a full grasp of that experience. And with that experience, there is the production of, in this conversation, we're calling art, right? Historic stuff, depending on how you look at it, right? In this conversation, we're calling it art. They're saying, oh my gosh, what is that? So there's this lack of education about Native American art. So one of the challenges that I have of putting Native American art in an American gallery is, and maybe I'm totally misinterpreting this, is with that we're assuming all narratives are equal. And in fact, they're not. People understand the American experience, but do not necessarily understand the Native American experience. And oftentimes I see museums where they put a Western settler art next to a historic Native American work so they can have this conversation. But the vast majority of people don't know the Native American aspect, so they're only hearing one side of the conversation and not really knowing the other side of the conversation. So for me, what I'm an advocate for, I think, is to have a gallery of Native American art to share that cultural experience. So when people go in, they can experience it as the museum organizes it, but also have it spread out throughout the gallery. That's just my.
I agree. And museum science agrees with you, right? You get into that heavy duty, like how do visitors move in a museum? And I think often museums have kind of done a knee jerk to go into, okay, ethnic differences, they're all the same, those ethnic differences. And the science shows that the American Indian experience, just as you said, is so unique, it's so weighty. And even the way museum visitors respond to Native experiences differs from other American experiences, whether it's an immigrant experience, whether it's a Black experience, it differs, right? The salience is leaning towards, as you can imagine, the one-dimensional stereotypes, right? And the power of those popular culture images exceeds, I think, I'm going to argue, I'm kind of going on a limb here, from what we think about as a generic American difference frame, right? So even the way people learn is something that I just want to kind of keep in the conversation, because it's justified there too, not only from an aesthetic experience, but from an educational experience, yeah.
And I think I'm dealing more at an emotional level as opposed to a museum guy level, is one of the things that drives me a little bit crazy is saying, well, we're going to expose our gallery to Native American art in this conversation with something else. And my knee-jerk reaction is, well, when are we going to have a place to tell our own stories on our own terms, about our own culture, about our own ways, without these other voices? And I think for the vast majority of museums, that is lacking. And here at the Autry, we clearly have a need from our audience to tell these stories. I was talking with with Sarah, head of education, and hopefully I got this right. If I don't, I think she's in the back, she'll yell at me. Is that the most requested education materials we get from schools is Native America. The most. Dallin, do you have any comments? No? Okay. All right, I'm going to do Phil Donahue style. So if anybody has a question, raise your hand. Really? Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you.
You want to hold it?
Sure, I'll hold it.
Thank you guys for being here. I work locally in Ventura with the Unified School District K through 12. I've been involved in music, social activism. It was very touching to see Winston Street, as it was called when I was there a few years back, Indian Alley. To get the shout out from Stephen, what I was curious about was, how is it that we reach children today in the midst of all this technology, in the midst of all this culture that continues to be immersive, in a way that will inspire them to pick up the torch from where you guys are, from where I am, because that's something that I personally and professionally, I really believe strongly in. How do we actually inspire kids so it's not just a matter of putting it in front of them and hoping they don't fall asleep or hoping they don't get distracted on how cool something might look, but to actually move them in a way that makes them want to personalize it and take it on as something that they believe in.
Well, I hope that it's through finding or showing them where they are in it, right? Because then they see the connection to whatever they're learning, that they're actually a part of that, or that they have some connection to it, and then what they want to do with it, And I think I mentioned this already, but like when I started to work with the photos, I really was grappling with like, how do I tell my children, how do I raise my children here in LA, fourth generation in LA, right, about who they are, where they're from, amongst, a lot of other people, a lot of other Native people from all over the country, right? How do I make sure they hold on to something that's uniquely theirs, but also connected to this broader community and special and unique and like all these things. And so I'm constantly trying to figure out like, how do I show other children? I think they kind of get it, my kids, but I think maybe just, I'm biased, but I think I'm hoping that other children and other people, when they see these photos, they're like, oh yeah, that's my family, or somebody who reminds me of my family. And I'm I have just as much, I'm just as important as anybody else who's been here, right? Or who comes here later. So.
Anybody else like to, I think basically is the work that is doing, how do we inspire the next generation to continue these things, not only these discussions, and through, in this particular case, with art, and earlier we've talked about these cultural connections, how do we ensure that we work with and pass it on to the next generation?
Yeah, as an educator, I really feel you when you ask that question. And that's probably like the area, because I'm in higher education, that's furthest from my reach. And so first of all, just let me thank you for the work that you're doing. I just admire it. And I'm happy to help if we could exchange information. I'm happy to kick around ideas afterwards. For me, as just a generic educator, I always say I have on a tool belt. And just drop me into a room, and you just have to figure out what's going to work. So, I mean, again, it's pretty specific, but I think we're back to that quandary on the audience. Can you teach a child who's culturally imbued, right, and knows a lot, in the same context with a classroom that's going woo-woo, and doing the paper headdresses? Like, is that even possible? I actually just want to go take that tribal child to the side and say, do you want to go to the library and do something else right now? Because mixing them is almost a disservice. I'm a grandmother. I've got grandchildren, tribal citizens here in Los Angeles, long way from Oklahoma, right? And so, the work that we do in Oklahoma is very different than anything they're ever going to get in LA. I'm glad they have the LA experience, right? They're global citizens. But I don't even know that any school could teach them anything about their culture here in Los Angeles. I just don't even hope for that, honestly. Like, I just want to bring them home. IAIA in Santa Fe, right? For a while, they played with the idea of it being Institute of American Indian, Alaska Native Arts and Cultural Development. They added cultural development at the end. Huge firestorm, you can imagine. Because tribal people were like, what, you're going to develop culture at that school? Like, no. Right? And they cut the cultural development part out of the title. So it is sensitive. I mean, and I just think we have to stay really attuned to that. Yeah.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Oh, okay. Oh, thank goodness. I feel bad because I didn't come over and offer you right off the bat. So pardon me.
Okay, so defining Native art. So you found the imagery, right? And it's like all of a sudden, this is Native art. We're going to do an exhibit. We're going to talk about this. So what if, for instance, I'm sure it's not, but what if, for instance, the photographer of all these images is a white person? And is that Native art? Okay, so when we have these found images, like, people open up boxes and find these beautiful images of Native Americans or cultural situations, and it's not photographed by a Native person. Is that Native art? And I think for your curriculum.
Just to make it really clear, the UAII approached us with this group of photographs that they own and asked us if we could do an exhibit for them. But the authorship, this is good. Yeah, I want to, just for the audience, just to have that part be clear. So I asked for a hard question. Kathleen gave us one. I love it. Thank you. I think that's evidence. I want Celestina to for sure chime in here. But, for me, when I was looking at that image of that father being tender with the child and how that's such a rare image for us to see. So for me, I'm not, I have aesthetic appreciation for things, but that picture for me is like evidence. It's like, don't try to tell me that Native dads aren't good parents. I have evidence here of this photograph, of the tenderness of this moment, right? And there's thousands of these. So, I guess I would say that my need, my desire, my passion for humanity, for our communities, is that I love that evidence, and I don't care who took that photographs, right? Because I'm going to mobilize that and use it. That's a tool. Again, it's a tool for me. And in terms of aesthetics, I think it does matter. 100%. I think it does matter. So if you're a commercial artist and, your vision is going to be very different, I think, than someone who's deeply immersed. And the Horace Pulaw Photograph Project taught me so much with this, because when you look at his photographs, so this is a book, it's Poolaw, the photograph for love of his. The photographs are being exhibited under For Love of His People. And I think, Rick, you can tell me, or someone, I think it's traveling still. Because I spent 15 years with those photographs, I can see his eye. I can see his heart. I can see everything. I mean, it's his vision, and it's a unique vision. It's not like any of the other photographs. So, yeah, I think aesthetically, it does matter. Yeah, but I don't know.
I don't know. That's always like the hard question, right? Like if it's not taken by a Native person, then is it still Native art? Yeah. Yeah, I don't agree with that Curtis is Native art. I don't know if that's a terrible thing to say in public on Zoom and everything, but I think that it's about like how people are being looked at, how they're engaging with the person who's taking the photo with them, and kind of also what the purpose is. Even though I can't even say there was one purpose to these photos that from UAII, right? But I think that my gut reaction is no. But I think that there's probably some nuances in there where if the person taking the photo has a different type of engagement with the people that they're taking the photo of, then maybe.
I would just say it's not. I mean, I think Native photographers might look at their subjects a little differently than non-Native photographers. But what are we really talking about, right? I think as Native peoples, we're fiercely protective of our culture. We don't feel a sense of ownership in as much as it's just stuff that's been given to us for specific reasons, whether it's ceremonial, whether it's narrative art expressions. These are things that we've seen exploited, that we've seen abused, that we've seen commodified and commercialized. But is the theme Native? Absolutely. Are they able to capture certain elements that people respond to? For sure. I've seen fathers taking care of their kids every weekend for 40 years at every powwow dance you ever go to. That's not novel to me. That's just who we are. We take care of our children. We take care of each other. Is it novel to somebody else? Probably. But we're talking about a cultural context that we can absolutely be fiercely protective of, and still share, I think, with the world. So I don't think that was an answer, but I did say at the beginning, no, it's probably not Native art, but is it a Native topic? Yes. So maybe that's the answer.
Well, and I think that the importance of the images isn't who took them, it's what's portrayed in them. And that sort of purpose of how they're being used is a really integral part of it. And so, I don't know how these were displayed, if they were displayed as photographer unknown, but that sort of open-endedness of it, I think, is one of the least interesting things about it. It's what's in those images, what those images means to people. That's the really fascinating and important part of them as a part of our visual culture and our Native art conversations.
Yeah, I'm absolutely grateful for projects like that because it is part of our culture. It is part of our historical narratives. It tells a story about, how we have fought against assimilation policies and relocation efforts, and how we are resilient and how we survived, and how we all have families that were relocated. And it actually shocked me to know that like 65% of the Native population in the United States lives outside of tribal trust lands, outside of reservation lands. It actually made me feel a little better because I often feel disconnected because I don't live on my reservations. But we're making that fight.
Okay.
I have a question about we who are not natives collecting Native American Indian art. And it starts with this. We at the Autry here sponsor a marketplace. It's, maybe 120 Native American Indian artists come, and we try to create a marketplace where lots of people come and buy that art. And that's contemporary art. And, the Santa Fe markets and so on. But that was also going on, I would observe, in similar context, but also somewhat different context. Back in the 1890s, let's say, if you were in Juneau, Alaska, and you saw Tlingit Indian women selling baskets they had made to the tourists who came through on steamships, or in the Southwest, when the railroad came through, really from when the railroads first arrived and for decades after that, there would be women bringing pottery that they had made or other art. And here's the question I'm asking. It's a temporal question. How do you view a collector collecting contemporary Indian art made in the 2020s versus a collector collecting art that was made to be sold into broader culture in the 1930s or 1890s? Is there time at which the art made and sold into the market as contemporary art somehow becomes less appropriate to collect 50 years later? Should your art be collected 50 or 100 years later through secondary markets?
All right, that's a great question. So, probably my first response is, do we really need to compare the two? Because in the 1890s, it was contemporary art, right? It was a traditional medium. We look at it as a traditional medium. We can look at things like, native jewelry. When did we really start doing silver work and absorb it and label it as traditional? When did we really start embracing mediums like oil paints and acrylics versus natural earth dyes? And that's where it gets complicated, right? In the cultural context of the time, you're absolutely right. Tourism drove huge amounts of interest in native cultures. There was an accessibility shift where they had prior been just simply reading about the Indian wars or Indian culture. Maybe they were exposed to some Eastern starboard tribes at some point. There's a fascination with things that are different, and it's no different today, right? But when is it appropriate for things that are like sacred, That's hard to say. We can look at the way certain museums or certain collectors have acquired sacred objects and to try and determine, was it ethical? Was it moral? Was it, in the cultural context of its time, okay? If you have a collection built on, off the bodies of massacred tribes and individuals, that's probably never okay, But if you have a collection where you've approached an artist and they've created a piece and it's not within the constraints of their tribal spiritualism, probably still okay, Now let's say that for some weird reason, they decide to define something as sacred down the road, and they decide that, hey, we need that back, or it is of such cultural importance that maybe it's not sacred, but it's a part of our tribal community history. Should we be the caretakers of it? Absolutely. There is no separation between often very utilitarian objects and some of our cultural traditions and spirituality. Our relationship with, let's take an elk, for example. Let's say we see a carved elk spoon, right? Horn spoon. There are elk medicine societies that still use some of those medicines. I have an bull elk ivory necklace that I feel, anyway. But is it appropriate to sell? I don't know, maybe down the road that does happen. But at some point, I think we can move beyond this definition of is it appropriate or not and just say, well, I have a friend and my friend has decided that this is how they feel. Am I a good enough friend that I will take that into consideration, regard their feelings, and act appropriately, or will I ignore it because I aesthetically enjoy this too much, or I need to own these pieces because it makes me feel somehow, right? Again, there's no real easy answer, but I would say let's let the tribes decide. And we can launch into some other stuff, but I don't know how to answer it any other way.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, though, because I was thinking about how were these works acquired. There's a difference between selling something that you've made specifically to sell to tourists and selling something because your entire culture is being systematically destroyed and you need to make money somehow. And this is the one way you're able to do it because people are coming in and telling you that they will give you money for the things that are precious to you and you need to feed your children. And so those sort of backgrounds of how the works are acquired are very important in considering that. And the Indian market today is relatively considered a safe space to purchase Native art because there is that idea that is why it exists, to avoid those other types of situations. And it's people's jobs, it's their livelihoods. They are working artists, that this is a venue that they are able to sell their art to people. But I love that idea that at some point somebody could come and say, you know what? Dallin has been gone for 100 years. We have decided everything he ever made was sacred. Give it back. Yeah. And my hope would be that there would be an openness to that there hasn't always been an openness to.
I do have one experience to share because it seems kind of applicable. I went to a pretty well-known art gallery that deals in historical Native objects. And I came around the corner and there was this experience that I had. And I honed in on this wand, and it was a simple, short 8-inch wand. It had a carved head at the top, but I knew it was powerful. And I was like kind of taken aback, right? And I'm not from the culture, we're related Plains culture, but I'm not from that tribe. But I was talking to my friend who was the manager of the gallery. He's like, hey, where'd you guys get that? And he wouldn't tell me at first. He's like, well, it came out of a collection, and we're selling it on consignment. $100,000, $110,000, right? Simple. And I was suitably horrified. I was like, oh my God, because eventually he did tell me that it was a tribal member who had sold it, right? And I was like, oh my God, this seems like it would be an object of such incredible medicine and importance that it needs to stay within the confines and the protection of the tribe. But then I had a little bit of an epiphany, right? I was like, well, conversely, why am I so arrogant to profess to know or tell them what is still sacred, what is not sacred? I don't know the story behind that object. I don't want to even talk to him about it because I don't want to know the story. But what I do know is that maybe that object, once it's used and has done, it is no longer a sacred object. I don't know. And that's not the case for every tribe, but maybe it is for his. Maybe he had gotten permission from their medicine societies to sell that piece. Maybe he was in dire straits and he needed to sell that piece, and he had to trust that creator would bring that piece back to his people at some point. I don't know, but what I do know is that I shouldn't judge whatever reason it was that took that piece to that place and wherever it ended up. Because what I have seen is incredible pieces that have gone out into the world through a variety of different methods, some good, some not so good, make their way back for use. I have my own repatriation project going on. We have these gajisats, these false faces that we use at our longhouse ceremonies. And they're not supposed to be sold. But there was a tourist initiative in the 1920s and 30s where they paid Seneca, Mohawk artists to create masks, regalia, outfits, gastoats. You see a lot of those incredible beaded pin cushions and whimsies. But those false faces, they've made their ways into museums. I've been able to consult and go in and talk to these masks, and my friends, they take care of these masks. But when I see them on the market, I buy them, right? So by definition, I'm engaging in the commodification of a sacred object. But am I ever going to sell them again? No. I have them in my house. I take care of them, feed them. At some point, they'll go back to the longhouse. I try to educate those dealers as to what they are and how important they are. And about 50% of the time they say, yeah, I don't think I'll deal in those anymore. So it's a small step, but it's an important step forward. I just want to get them off the market, one mask, one spirit at a time, right?
Thank you, everybody, for the great sessions today, for the great presentations, for the great panel and discussion. I really appreciate everybody coming here.
Thank you, Joe.
So before we go to lunch, for those of you who were around yesterday at the RC, we had our first day of sessions over there. And now that I'm here for our second day, it's a different vibe. And I couldn't figure out why. I go, why is there a different vibe being up here? I've never been up here before, but that usually doesn't bother me. But then I was standing over here and I was kind of looking around as my friends here were talking. And then I realized that, all of today we're focusing on Marshall McKay's things that were important to him in his life, which is Native art. Next session is California Native art. Then over here I realized Marshall's looking over our shoulder. And I was like, whoa. And then the way the photograph, I was standing over here, he kept looking at me. I was standing over here, he kept looking at me. So I just want to put that out there. Okay, so lunch is going to be out and across the way. Elders first, then the rest of us. We'll see everybody back here for the next session at 1:30. Elders first.